I've been asked to give a talk, as I just said, on the Mustang, and before getting onto the III bit about flying it, I thought it behoves the talk to talk about the Mustang itself and how it all came about. The P-51D, it didn't start as that. The very first one that was produced by North American was this model. It was called the NA-73X. And obviously it was very much a test machine produced by North American because they were getting the act of coming up with suitable warbirds. Going back a little bit, there was an organisation in New York called the British Purchasing Company, and they had already purchased 200 T6 type aircraft, which went to the UK as Harvards, and from Lockheed they bought 200 Hudsons, basically reconnaissance models. So a foot had gone in the door to buy aircraft externally for the Brits. With the oncoming saga of what was about to happen, as they could foresee in Europe, they knew that their own war machine could not produce the aircraft in the quantities that they thought they would need, so they went to the States to enhance getting more aircraft. Anyway, when they went to the US, the concept of initially what they wanted to do was to get licensing to copy the P-40. They considered the P-40 was the best bet going then, and Curtiss couldn't produce the numbers, so the idea was to get other manufacturers under license to build the aeroplane. When they went to the North American company in California, the people there said, "How long have we got to retool to produce your P-40? And they said basically 4 months or 120 days. And overnight, the North American team, under Dutchy Kindleberger and another guy called Raymond Rice, they did all their overnight sketching, and by morning time, breakfast, they asked to see the same delegation, and they offered them the new aircraft. And obviously a lot of it was based on that experimental aeroplane, the NA-73X. And the one that's on your screen now, obviously, is the start of what became the Mustang. They built the aeroplane in 102 days from start to finish, but it didn't have an engine. And it was designed around the Ellison V12, which is very similar to the Merlin, similar size, similar specifications, lower end horsepower. But they couldn't get engines because all the engines were already allocated to P-38s, the Kitty Hawk, and a couple of other aeroplanes. And it took them longer to get the engine, and once they got 2 engines, dropped them in, and it took another 20 days before the aeroplane flew. So it was 122 days from start to finish, from sketches to airborne. The first 2 went to the UK and packed up, shipped over there and flown with the Allisons. And it was the Brits who gave the term to the aeroplane the Mustang. They used to call all the aeroplanes by names. The T6 was called the Harvard, and so the Mustang became a new name for this aircraft. The aeroplane only had a single stage, that engine only has a single stage, single speed supercharger. And the aeroplane was good, but it wasn't very good. And basically, it ran out of puff above 10,000 feet. So initially it was trialled in the air-to-ground roll and more or less put on the side. Nobody was actually using it at that stage. Sorry for all the technical stuff, but like a horse without a carriage, you need some of this technical stuff to explain the coming of the Mustang. After they'd been using it a little while, obviously some whiz kid, because the Merlin was being used in both the Spitfire and the Hurricane, they re-engined these 2 Mustangs with the Merlin, and it just changed it from being a good aeroplane to a very, very good aeroplane. The Merlin has a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger, and obviously it's got no constraints once it goes above 10,000 feet, and it just turned into a magic aeroplane. Obviously the schematic there just shows a bit more, but that's more or less of the later model one. And likewise the P-51D, which became the later one as well. There's no quiz, so you don't have to look at any of the numbers. totally in the US, they were the only producers of the Mustang, and 15,500 approximately were made in 2 factories, and there were 4 models up to 1945, being the A, the BC, the same aeroplane but different factories, and the D, which is the most iconic one that everybody remembers because of the shape of the canopy, etc. The only other company that ever made the Mustang, the P-51s, was Australia. And Australia made 200 at the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. So that was included in the 15,500 worldwide. That picture there is one of the Australian Mustangs. There are some tiny differences, but you just about have to be a lamey to pick them. The cockpit. It is an aircraft. It's a wartime aircraft. It's obviously got wind instruments and reasonably conventional. I suppose the only thing that's a bit different up the top is the gun sight. Throttle quadrant, nothing special about that. Throttle, propeller control, mixture and friction. Friction becomes very important. It's the last thing one does on a takeoff is tighten up the friction. There's many a pilot, including myself, reach down to pull the undercarriage up and the throttle comes back and gets your attention for a moment. Fuel. The aeroplane was renowned obviously for what it could do in support of the bomber operations in Europe, because we all know it had just magic range compared with the local, like the Spitfire and the Hurricane, that was the short range fighter planes. So the Mustang then was used as an escort machine to go with the bombers, combat if necessary, and to get home. They managed it because of fuel, just looking at that. 2 main tanks, a fuselage tank, and 2 drop tanks. And in round numbers, I put it down as about 450 gallons or 1,600 litres. The drop tanks, they're an interesting story on their own, as much as there were several, but the one on the left, the 75-gallon tank, was an all-aluminium tank, and they were using them for quite a while. And when the tanks were being jettisoned over Europe, it gave them a supply of aluminium, but also it was getting costly for the supply of these tanks. So the one on the right, it says it's a paper tank. It holds more fuel, that's US gallons, and it was made out of paper mache and shellac. Wasn't very good at holding the fuel, so they were only there's a couple of steel bands really was the, you might say, the backbone of the tank, and the rest was the paper mache and a couple of fittings on it. It was only fueled just prior to cranking up the aeroplane and going, because obviously the fuel interacted with the shellac and it started to leak. But by that stage it was a throwaway item. You see a couple of guys there fitting the tanks. When you think of a 44-gallon drum, as we all knew them, which is a couple of 100 litres, this tank there is holding twice as much as a 44-gallon drum and a bit more. Armament. They played around with armament on the Mustang, but they had some smaller guns, but they did finish up with the 6 guns, 3 in each wing, 50 caliber, and each gun carried about 9 yards or 27 foot of shells, and it roughly works out about 11 shells per foot, so each belt's about 300 rounds. There is a saying if we've all heard of it, in the combat guys used to say, give them the whole 9 yards, and that was it, where it was just one big long burst, particularly if they were strafing trains and ground gear. The aeroplane also carried rockets, various configurations. That's just one picture there of rockets that were slung under the wing. The walk around, the only reason putting that there is well, this particular one was the colour scheme. It was the Flying Undertaker. Going back a bit to Mustangs per se, my lovely dear friend Bill Wyllie, who owned the Mustang that was here, he used to work on Mustangs when he was a motorbike mechanic in Perth, And he used to be at Citizens Air Force 25 Squadron on the weekends working on Mustangs. He did fly in Malaya, and I first met Bill in Hong Kong, and we all used to talk about either cars or aeroplanes or both, usually over a beer. And Bill always said one day he'd like a Mustang. This was on the front of a magazine that I picked up in the States, the walk around on the Mustang. And coincidentally, Bill was in the UK, and he saw a model of the Mustang, and it was exactly the same as that. So that became his adopted paint scheme for the aeroplane when it was all put together here in Perth. It was an adopted paint scheme, obviously, because he didn't have the full history of the aeroplane project. When he wanted to buy a project, one of the engineers from here, Shane Gifford from Formula Aviation, he was tasked to go to the US for this project that was on offer, and he was only armed with a parts manual, because there's no manuals out there to tell you how to rebuild a Mustang. But he went with a parts manual, so he was able to identify what bits were there and what bits were missing. The wings were already farmed out to another wing builder in the US, in Salinas, and the engine was with a crowd in Tehachapi being rebuilt. So it was basically just the fuselage that he was looking at. And he came back to Bill with the message that it was a viable project, it was purchased, and it was shipped to Perth. So part of the project being rebuilt down at Panama Jacks was, how do you paint it? What do you call it? And so Bill used this adopted paint scheme, and it was the Flying Undertaker. And that was based around this guy, Major William Shomo. He was flying the Pacific, and he got the Congressional Medal of Honor. He had 7 kills in one flight. Rather remarkable. His family were undertakers back in the US, so that's why he adopted the Flying Undertaker. Bill didn't like that so much because he thought that was a bit, I suppose, morbid. And on the other side, you always had the crew chief's name on the wartime Mustangs, and the crew chief that looked after this aeroplane, his name was Snooky, or Snooks. Bill's wife then, Rhonda's, one of her best friends, her nickname was Snooky. And Bill said there was no way he could put Flying Undertaker on one side and Snooky on the other side. So that didn't quite happen. But Bill was a taipan in Hong Kong, and the taipan typically, he always, on his boats and everything, he had the Tiger. And so the aeroplane here didn't have Flying Undertaker, it had the Tiger on that left-hand side that people may remember. That's Major Shomo, just days after his 7-kill mission. And there was Bill's aeroplane after its first flight. And as you can see, not that it's that large, the Tiger there is on the left-hand side, and the other side was blank. Bill went on further with his collection. He did start off with the Texan, which is the one on the top, obviously. And the Mustang was next, the one on the bottom. And then he had the L-39, the Albatross jet. And that flight was done just south of here. We didn't think we'd be able to pull it off because the weather was against us, but we were then told the cloud base was about 5,000 feet. And we went up chasing a 210 with a professional photographer, and he managed to get that shot. It's been on lots of magazines and it's been around quite a bit. Immaterial, that was the crew. And a couple of, so you get a mention, there's Bill very happily sitting in the cockpit of his Texan. Bill never flew the Mustang from the front seat. He just said that the engine management he thought was beyond him. But he was more than happy flying his Texan. That was his Texan. We brought in half a dozen from California through Robbie Poynton down there at Panama Jacks. And Bill's was the only G model, all the rest were Ds. But the G was Bill's, and a couple of differences, mainly when you look at the canopy looked more open than the others. The Ds and the early ones got a few more frames, so that was a nicer looking canopy arrangement. To complete this, the Mustang, since when Bill succumbed with cancer, the family decreed that the collection be sold, and so they all disappeared. The Mustang, it's had, after Bill sold it, it's had 3 other owners, and the 4th owner, it's now got, is a guy called Bishop, Brad Bishop, and it's in Archerfield in Brisbane. His other aeroplane, I understand, is the Spitfire, which I think he bought, was the 2nd one from Temora. That shot was during COVID, and he was getting a bit brassed off being in quarantine in Brisbane, and they did a flight up to Kingaroy, where that is, I think just to get out of the city for half an hour or so. That's all I want to really say about the Mustang at this stage. That just gives you a bit of background to the actual aeroplane. So I think we'll call it a break now. Part 2 in about 10 minutes.